As we enter the second week of the campaign, the world teeters on the edge of a potential global recession. Stock markets have suffered their steepest plunge since the height of the pandemic, sending shockwaves through investor confidence and even igniting fears that new tariffs could trigger widespread defaults. This sudden economic turmoil couldn't have hit at a more politically sensitive time for us here in Australia, with political consequences as unpredictable as the events themselves. Right now, as we enter the second week, Dutton has fallen behind. The polls show Labor is perhaps in striking distance of winning government. This was a sobering reality check for the opposition leader and a wake-up call for his inner sanctum, who told me today they're not panicking. Dutton is getting advice about sharpening his message, dumping unpopular policies, and improving attack ads. He's focusing on stepping up. But at the same time, the world around us unravels. The ASX lost 4% in value, while the US markets fell 6% on Friday. Now, for Australia, that's a $100 billion wipeout on the ASX. And the concern now is whether or not this will plunge us into a recession. It has the potential to reshape the race if this isn't just a market shock, but if it continues into a deeper problem. Trump's tariffs triggered the financial market meltdown, and there's no sign the president's backing down. Here he was on Air Force One, responding to questions about the stock market crash.
What's going to happen with the market, I can't tell you, but I can tell you our country has gotten a lot stronger. I don't want anything to go down, but sometimes you have to take medicine to fix something.
Take medicine, that's how he's seeing it. So he's standing firm, but the Wall Street Journal speculates that if markets continue in turmoil or if a recession looms and his approval rating craters, the president may feel the need for a face-saving escape route. That could be when he decides to spin his tariffs, not as a permanent, but as the genius negotiating strategy his apologists claim it is. Now, Trump did promise, as the Wall Street Journal noted, he did promise a boom to working class voters. And right now, growth estimates are falling. And some economists, including those at JP Morgan, are now predicting a recession. You'd presume a recession wouldn't be a legacy that Trump is hoping for during his second term. Now, as we spoke about on Thursday, Trump is trying to return manufacturing to the United States, partly to deal with the threat of China. This is a long-term strategy, and the stock market volatility is not a surprise. But the question is whether this is simply a rocky blip or whether this could deteriorate into a global recession. Now, the Wall Street Journal editorial board continued to say that the Wall Street consensus has been wrong before and nothing is foreordained. Trade retaliation could be less than feared, and Trump could change course. But policymakers ignore market signals at their peril. Now, back to Australia. A global recession wouldn't eventuate during this short election campaign, but it could become obvious that that's where we are heading. If so, this completely reshapes the entire campaign. It plays into voters' minds when they're deciding how to cast their ballot. Dutton's team are confident that voters would turn to the coalition, believing that they're best placed to navigate an uncertain economic environment. But there is also a view that the global uncertainty benefits incumbency, and thus, in this instance, Albanese would benefit politically. And there's a view that voters prefer left-of-centre parties to deal with Trump. Now, as you know, Albanese has already been trying to benefit politically by continually comparing Dutton to Trump, as the Fin Review says today, to paint Dutton as the Trumpian candidate. Like Labor's original Mediscare, there is no substance to the claims being spread through social media. If Labor won the end of such scare tactics, it would be crying misinformation. The Fin Review ultimately concluded in the editorial that while Labor has no compelling record on economic resilience to reward with a second term, the Trump effect could help sweep Albo back into office. And it makes Dutton's task far more challenging. Treasurer Jim Chalmers today was already crafting the narrative that he's better placed to handle a recession, which he warns is a real risk. Now, I find it interesting how the government can never comment on interest rate movements when they're in a rising cycle. They cite the independence of the Reserve Bank. But of course, during an election campaign, this all changes. And Chalmers today predicted up to 4 rate cuts.
Markets are now expecting around 4 interest rate cuts in Australia this calendar year. There's even a more than even money expectation in the markets, more than 50% expectation in the markets that the next Reserve Bank interest rate cut in May might be as big as 50 basis points.
And Treasury modelling shows there's expected to be a hit on Australian GDP, also prices, although how much of this is because of Trump's tariffs and how much of this are domestic factors is arguable. Economist Warren Hogan told me today that much of the impact in Australia is because of the Albanese government and not the tariffs. He spoke about other effects of the tariffs with Peter Credlin earlier.
Yeah, well, the markets are panicking and their response is pretty severe and pricing in not only a full rate cut in May, but a chance of a 50-point cut and then follow-up cuts at every meeting. We're talking about 4 or 5 rate cuts, taking the cash rate down to about 3%. Look, that could easily play out if the worst happens. If it's not a broader financial problem, if it's really just this tariff issue, I think the RBA would be thinking about that they've got 2 or 3 rate cuts up their sleeve that would take the rate down to 3.5, which they think's about neutral.
So it's against this backdrop that Dutton starts the second week of the campaign. And yes, he's behind, as we've canvassed, but there's still another 4 weeks to go. Today, the news, he dumped his policy to get workers back to the office, at least public service workers in Canberra. It's precisely the same policy, and New South Wales Premier Chris Minns, who's had very little backlash and who certainly hasn't been compared to Donald Trump. But Dutton was losing support, not just with women, as has been reported, but with families. And so he made the call to dump it.
Are you conceding this policy was unpopular with female voters?
We got it wrong and we've apologised for it. We support flexible workplace arrangements, and our plan, which was only ever targeted for the public service in Canberra, Labor's been able to create into a scare campaign.
And Albanese, of course, had nothing better to do or nothing better to announce than continue on with this scare campaign. He visited a family this morning who worked from home in Melbourne, which was never part of Dutton's policy in any case.
Peter Dutton wants to undermine work rights and in particular doesn't understand modern families, doesn't understand the important role that women and men play in organising their families and organising appropriate work conditions wherever it is possible.
Just a side note there, I mean, people criticise Peter Dutton for not being a good enough communicator. I mean, listen to the Prime Minister. That's hardly a great orator. Now, despite what the Prime Minister says, changing policy isn't a negative thing. It's a brave admission that Dutton has listened to the community and was prepared to change. It's a strength to admit that he got something wrong and then change course. He was transparent and public about it. I mean, you think of the contrast with Albanese. He's never apologised or admitted to getting anything wrong. In his arrogance, it's always someone else's fault and someone else's responsibility. And his arrogance is bizarre when he's not particularly clever and doesn't work hard enough to get across the detail. I'd bet he was probably a grade C student at school, not exactly the genius you'd want running our country. But more worryingly is Albanese's character and integrity. He lies about major things, like the Port of Darwin decision, and tiny things like whether or not he fell off the stage. Now, on the Port of Darwin, Albanese heard that Dutton was about to make an announcement that the coalition would buy back the lease. That was thanks to the leak of a Labor-friendly journalist. But Albanese heard about it, and so he quickly rang into a local Darwin radio station to gazump Dutton's announcement. But the radio announcer was too smart and smelled a rat.
I've gotten a little bit lost here. You've flagged the coalition making an announcement tomorrow that the coalition are going to say that they'll buy the lease back, but you're not making that announcement today.
You bet we will. We've been working on this issue for some time.
So I just need to be clear here. Are you announcing that the Labor government will buy back the Port of Darwin lease off Lambridge?
What we are doing is we will enter into negotiations to do that. That is what we've been doing informally through potential buyers up to this point already.
So are you buying back the lease of the Port of Darwin or not?
Well, what we're doing is trying to see if there's a private buyer through particularly superannuation funds that we've had discussions with. They have sanded out Lambridge as well. We want that to be the case, but we want it.
And it went on. I mean, she's far better than the average press gallery journalist that Albanese is used to. Have a listen.
So you're making sure you have a buyer first before you announce those plans?
Well, we want it to be in Australian hands. We prefer that it be through superannuation funds or some other vehicle. So
when might you have a clearer idea about whether you have a buyer or not, and whether this is a plan that you are proceeding with? Will you have those details during this election campaign prior to the 3rd of May? Will you be able to tell us, we are buying back the port and this is how we're going to do it?
We certainly will enter into those discussions, and the Northern Territory Government have had discussions with us as well. We'll have more to say over the coming period before the 3rd of May.
Yeah, we have covered that. I'm just wondering how much the federal government would be willing to contribute to buy back the Port of Darwin.
Well, what you don't do is negotiate through a radio station.
If you don't negotiate through a radio station, then why are you ringing one up? Well, it's because he was trying to scupper Dutton's announcement to return the Port of Darwin to Australian ownership. Now, these were questions he should have been expecting, but of course he hadn't worked them through, because he only did that interview when he got wind of Dutton's press conference the next day. But here's another interesting thing. What you just heard from Albanese was the precise opposite of what he said just 18 months ago. In October 2023, Albanese said he accepted a report of his own agency that the Chinese-linked company could continue to operate the lease. And he says, and I quote, that the issue had now been resolved. Game over. Here's what he said. He said, and we've accepted that report rather than have to lay out a considerable compensation cost, which would have been applicable if there was any forced intervention and forced sale by the Commonwealth. So that issue has now been resolved. There won't be an intervention for any forced sale. He was categoric about it. That was October 2023, just a year and a half ago. But now, when he got wind that Dutton was announcing a sale, he changed his tune. He claimed he'd already been working on this. So compare the comments you just heard, game over or resolved, to what he says now.
The idea that you would have the major port in Northern Australia owned by any foreign interest is not in Australia's national interest.
Albanese refuses to even acknowledge he's backtracked, let alone admit to a 180 shift in position. He's so consumed with outfoxing Dutton, so fixated on stealing his thunder over the Port of Darwin, that substance and well-thought-out policy has taken a back seat to cheap tricks and tactics. His superficial answers in that radio interview exposed a hollow narrative from a hollow man. If voters are paying attention, and that's an if voters are paying attention, if they look beyond the headlines, then Albanese's lack of integrity and obsession with spin will be his own undoing. Yet right now, while Dutton is trying to find his rhythm in his first election campaign as leader, Trump has lobbed a political grenade into the mix, a wild card so volatile that its impact on the election campaign remains anyone's guess.